January 29th, 4 p.m. I will make no preamble other than to say that the events of the past 48 hours have been disastrous. We had made it as far north as the 65th parallel with relative ease. The wind had picked up to 43 knots, but we were able to compensate enough on our starboard propeller to make for relatively tolerable flight. But by the time we reached the Great Bear Lake, the engines were running hot, and the wind had taken a toll on our stabilizers. We were hoping it would let up soon enough for us to turn westward, but it did not. The skies were clouded to every corner of the horizon, and growing heavier by the minute. I had my eye on the airbag, directing the men to hold fast on the capstan, when an exceptionally forceful gust nearly threw me from my feet. Not a second later, there was a loud clang behind me. I spun about in alarm to see the Revenant's anemometer and vane lying on the deck, wrested loose from its mooring above the wheelhouse. Without it, we could no longer gauge the wind speed, but it hardly seemed necessary anymore, for it was clearly well over 50 knots. I leapt up the stairs to the bridge and ducked into the wheelhouse. Mickelson's knuckles were white at the helm, and Bromberg was barking over the speaking tube for all hands below to secure the cargo. I glanced at the barometer and saw that it had plummeted. Perhaps it was because we were so used to rough hauls, or perhaps with our streak of misfortune we didn't think it could get any worse. But for whatever reason, all of us were surprised when the first lightning bolt split the ether off the port side. Though not as surprised as we were by the deafening thunder that sounded not 10 seconds later. The rain followed instantly and intensely, and another gust shook the airbag and swung the hull to starboard. The captain ordered lifelines secured for all hands and to man the capstan. I stepped out of the wheelhouse and relayed the order to the top deck. Scott, O'Grady, Kovacs, and Roberts threw on their safety harnesses and buckled their lifelines to the pin rail. The four of them put all their weight against the capstan and wound the envelope tight around the airbag. I hitched my line to the quarterdeck rail and stepped back inside the wheelhouse for further instruction. We were not faced with many options. The gale was too strong to attempt a landing, and the storm reached higher than the Revenant could climb. And it was getting closer. The rain had drastically impaired visibility, and our stabilizers were being battered off of their bolts. Our only course of action was to try and ride with the typhoon. There was no telling how far off course it would take us, but there would be no opposing the vehement tempest. Bromberg ordered hard to starboard and all ahead full. The storm drove us 1,100 clicks northwest. It was an arduous run, but we managed to keep at least 3 kilometers ahead of it at all times. At 6 o'clock this morning we passed over Victoria Island, and the storm showed no signs of abating nor changing trajectory. The rain bombarded our airbag like a fusillade of bullets. Our destination was now on the opposite side of the continent, and if we continued to try and outrun the torrent, it would drive us out over open sea, or into the Arctic. Captain Bromberg made the decision to try and circumvent the gale by means of a gradual westward turn. In order to do this, we would have to put more distance between us and the typhoon. Our engines were barely sustaining the propellers at full speed, and after 4 hours, 700 clicks, and some of the most relentless turbulence of my aeronautical career, we had made it west of Prince Patrick Island. The storm was directly south of us now, still blowing eastward, and we were nearly past it, when Bergeron and McSwain called up from the engine room to say that the engines were overheating. The headwind was putting too much strain on the bow. Bromberg called to retract the envelope struts and lower the balloon to decrease wind resistance. I do not dispute that this was a wise decision on the captain's part. Were it not for the sudden, unexpected calamity that befell us in the process of retracting the struts, I honestly believe we would have made it. Bergeron and McSwain had started the motor to lower the envelope, when an abrupt and errant updraft shattered the jib boom. Its broken tip hurtled backwards and became lodged between the rack and pinion wheel of the port side strut motor, utterly jamming the mechanism. The result of this accident was ruinous. The port strut was locked in position, but the starboard strut continued to retract. The creaking, buckling of iron was audible even above the cacophony of the typhoon as the port strut was bent like a pipe. All hands fought to gain some steady foothold as the airbag was brutally wrenched starboard from its level position, rendering the entire vessel lopsided and off balance. From then on, all was chaos. The unforgiving wind tossed our crooked boat about like a wounded gull. The Revenant shook and pitched and heaved. Our structure was compromised, our buoyancy was compromised, our stabilizers were useless. Mickelson could do nothing to keep us level or afloat. We all braced ourselves as the Revenant plummeted out of the sky, tumbling over and over, every timber and plate shuddering. I clung to the wheelhouse bar with both hands, as did Bromberg. Mickelson looped his arms around the helm and held on for dear life. The 4 men on deck would have been thrown overboard had their lifelines not been fastened. Nevertheless, they took more of a pummeling than any of us. As the ship tumbled, poor O'Grady lost his grip on the capstan and went flying to starboard, ricocheting hard off of the far-tilted airbag and ultimately splitting his skull on the forecastle deck. I cannot definitively say for how long we fell. It mustn't have been more than 1 or 2 minutes, but it felt like an agonizingly long time. I cannot imagine how, but Captain Bromberg kept his wits amidst the dizzying plunge. Hand over hand, he made his way along the rail until he reached the helm. Hooking his left arm around the rail, he stretched out his right arm and pulled the port side emergency aerostat release. In an instant, the port stabilizer shot off of the hull, and within 10 seconds the auxiliary balloon had fully inflated. With a jarring lurch, the Revenant righted itself, hurling Bromberg across the cabin and shoulder first into the brass binnacle. He was hurt, but he had saved us. The aerostat wasn't enough to keep us aloft, but it was enough to slow our descent. Struggling to his feet, the captain gave a terse groan and roared over the speaking tube to brace for impact. I tightened my grip on the rail and bent my knees. There were 30 more harrowing seconds of expectant dread before the devastating impact. The Revenant's iron hull rung out like a gargantuan bell as the tremor shot through it. Every beam and bulkhead buckled from the irresistible force, every glass and porthole shattered. I could not keep my stance against it, and was thrown to the floor. I do not recall how long I lay there, incapacitated, but when I came to, my ears were ringing, my vision blurred, and the ship had settled. Bromberg and Mickelson lay prostrate on the floor, but were beginning to stir. Looking out the shattered porthole, I could see why the crash had been so harsh. It had not been a water landing. We had alighted brutally upon a vast ocean glacier. Bromberg, Mickelson, and I made our way, sorely, to our feet. The captain, clutching his shoulder, called down the speaking tube for all able hands to come topside. Mickelson and I helped him down the steps and onto the deck to assess the scale of our jeopardy. The port strut had been completely severed, and the airbag was ruptured on its underside. The auxiliary aerostat had deflated and was all but useless to us now. Scott, Kovacs, and Roberts were breathing, but badly injured. Scott's legs were broken, and all 3 of them were bruised and bleeding. The rest of the men came slowly topside, though some of them were missing. Lumpy, Atherton, and Preston had not survived the crash, and Rasmussen, McSwain, and Taggart were seriously injured. Mickelson and Pascal went about tending to the wounded, assisted by von Arkham. Apparently, our passenger had evaded injury by jumping into a crate containing one of Dr. Sutcliffe's operating tables. Bergeron informed me that the engines had sustained extensive damage. Various integral components had been warped or dislodged, and fuel was leaking. He believes they are not entirely beyond repair, but without McSwain to help him, he cannot say how long it will take. As if things weren't bad enough, he believes that there is a breach in the hull, as the engine room appears to be taking on water. Mickelson and I disembarked to further survey our predicament. I estimate the glacier is approximately 30 acres wide. The ice is thick, but there were already several long, deep cracks spidering out from the spot where we had landed. The stern was deeply embedded in the ice, and we did not hazard to get too close, but we could see that the blades of the starboard propeller were excessively bent. The Revenant is in bad shape, but that is not the worst of it. The wireless room is in complete disarray. So much so that LeBaron can't even speak to the condition of the apparatus. He is hard at work now trying to put everything back together. With any luck, we will be able to send an SOS. With the rupture in the airbag, the severed strut, the engines smashed and leaking fuel, the prospects of getting the Revenant back in the air on our own are not promising. The one piece of luck we seem to have is that our chart plot is still operational. We've crashed in the Arctic Ocean, several hundred kilometers north of the Beaufort Sea. Our precise coordinates are north latitude 77 degrees, west longitude 138 degrees. The nearest trade route is nearly 1,000 kilometers to the south. No ship comes this far north unless they're blown drastically off course as we were. So if we cannot signal for rescue, we cannot wait for it. Whilst LeBaron attempts to put the wireless room in order, the more fit among us are engaged in repairing the ship and tending to the wounded. Our modest med kit is woefully understocked, so we have taken the liberty of helping ourselves to Dr. Sutcliffe's tools, with full intention of reimbursing him for everything we use, though there is little of use to us apart from the anesthetic. Captain Bromberg broke his arm when he was thrown against the binnacle, but, bulldog that he is, put it in a sling and went about helping Pascal with the others. Scott, Kovacs, and Roberts are the worst. They are all bleeding internally, and Pascal fears that they have the bends after being out on deck during our sudden and turbulent descent. Pascal and the captain helped the three of them below deck and set Roberts' legs in splints. Taggart hit his head, and has been in and out of consciousness for the past 3 hours, for which Pascal has been applying ice. Rasmussen was securing the cargo in the hold when he went down, and took the brunt of a heavy crate square in the chest. 3 of his ribs are cracked or broken, and his breathing is labored. There is little else to be done for him but to keep his chest bandaged tight. McSwain's injuries are truly unfortunate. It is scarcely less than a miracle that he survived at all. When the Revenant lurched to starboard, he fell face first into the firebox. He has suffered severe burns to his head and neck, and has lost the use of his left eye. Bromberg and Pascal bandaged him up and gave him water and put him to rest below deck with the others. As for the dead, we have sewn them in canvas and laid them on the forecastle deck. In this climate, their bodies will keep well in the open air. When we are returned home, we shall give our brave shipmates the proper burials they have earned. With McSwain incapacitated, Von Arkham has volunteered to aid Bergeron in mending the engines. Our curious passenger has professed to a certain degree of mechanical savvy, and has coincidentally brought his own toolkit on board. Whilst he and Bergeron labor below deck, Mickelson and I are about the mending of the airbag. The state of the engines is irrelevant if we can't get back in the air. The rupture is broad and deep. Both the envelope and the balloon are split through, and the ether is escaping rapidly. We have enough in the reserve tanks to refill it if we can fix the breach, but anything we come up with would only be a temporary fix. Then there is the matter of the strut. The brake is clean and should be easy enough to rejoin, but it was severely bent before it snapped. I cannot even begin to imagine how we would go about rectifying it, but we will cross that bridge when we come to it. The Revenant is nothing if not tenacious, as are we. But we have never had a wreck like this before. Crippled and bleeding in the middle of nowhere. I only hope that LeBaron can get the wireless working. Otherwise, we may be here a while.